The Diligence lurched to a halt on the 15th of September, 1843, depositing our artist at the crossroads near Amboise with his traveling cases and a stomach thoroughly unsettled by the journey from Paris. You might imagine him there, this man of 38 years, standing amid the golden dust of the Loire Valley Road, his dark coat marked with the powder of travel, squinting against the afternoon sun that painted the vineyards in shades of amber and rust. The harvest was beginning. Women in blue aprons moved between the vines like notes in some ancient score, their voices carrying across the distance in a melody older than memory. Our portraitist, let us not burden him with a name, for he could be any man who has ever mixed pigments and seen too much, adjusted his cases and began the walk toward Château de Montmoreau, visible now as a collection of towers and steep slate roofs rising from the river mist.
3 kilometers, the coachman had said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. You'll know it by the dead trees. And indeed, as he walked, the artist noticed how the avenue of chestnuts leading to the estate grew increasingly skeletal, their branches reaching toward the sky like supplicants frozen in prayer. The mind wanders during such walks, does it not? His certainly did, returning as it often did to his small apartment near the Pont Neuf, to the studio where his wife's portrait still hung, 5 years after consumption had claimed her. He touched the pocket watch in his vest, his father's, a clockmaker who had understood time's mechanics but never its cruelty. The weight of it reminded him why he accepted these provincial commissions. The money, yes, but also the escape from rooms too full of absence. The chateau revealed itself gradually, as such places do. First a gatehouse with its porter dozing in the September warmth, then formal gardens where roses bloomed in geometric precision, despite their gardener's obvious neglect. The building itself was a testament to 3 centuries of architectural ambition. Gothic bones dressed in Renaissance finery, windows added wherever fancy struck, towers sprouting like mushrooms after rain. Monsieur Henri de Montmoreau received him in the great hall, a space so vast that their footsteps echoed like drumbeats. You would notice Henri immediately in any room, not for his height, though he was tall enough, nor for his dress, though his gray silk vest spoke of means, but for the peculiar intensity of his pale eyes, the way they seemed to catalogue everything while revealing nothing. "You come highly recommended," Henri said, leading him through corridors lined with portraits. "The Duchess de Polignac speaks of your ability to capture not merely appearance, but essence." He paused before a painting of a young woman in the fashion of Louis Philippe's early reign. "My first wife, Marguerite, dead these 12 years. The artist studied the portrait. The woman had been beautiful, certainly, but there was something disturbing in her expression, a resignation that seemed premature for one so young. "A family weakness," Henri continued, as if reading his thoughts. "The women of Montmoreau have always been delicate. It is why this commission matters so greatly. I would have Celeste captured now, while she still—" He did not finish. They passed through a gallery where 7 more portraits hung, each showing a young woman, each bearing that same quality of ethereal fragility. The dates beneath them told their own story: 1798 to 1802, 1815 to 1819, 1826 to 1831. Not one had lived to see 30. "Your studio will be in the North Tower," Henri announced, climbing a spiral staircase that groaned beneath their weight. "The light is considered ideal." The room was indeed splendid for the purpose. circular, with tall windows facing north, furnished with an easel, a worn Turkish divan, and tables for mixing pigments. Someone had already arranged his cases there, unopened, waiting. But it was the view that caught him. From this height, he could see the Loire winding like a silver ribbon through the valley, the patchwork of vineyards and orchards, the village of Montmoreau huddled around its church spire. Smoke rose from chimneys preparing evening meals, and he could hear faintly the Angelus bells calling the faithful to prayer. "You'll dine with the family, naturally," Henri was saying. "My sister Isabelle manages the household. She will see to your needs."
The portrait sessions will begin day after tomorrow, allowing you time to prepare. He moved toward the door, then paused. "Tell me, monsieur, do you believe in fate?" The artist considered his response. In his experience, men who asked such questions had already decided their answer. "I believe in lead white and cobalt blue, monsieur. In the way light falls across a cheekbone. The rest I leave to philosophers." Henri smiled, though it did not reach those cataloging eyes. "A practical man. Good. We have had enough of dreamers in this house." He departed, his footsteps fading down the spiral stairs, leaving the artist alone with the dying light and the weight of all those portraits, those abbreviated lives, pressing against his consciousness like a hand against glass. He unpacked slowly, arranging his pigments with the care of a pharmacist preparing medicines. The toxic emerald green, the lead white that could kill as easily as capture light, the precious ultramarine worth more than gold. Each had its purpose, its danger, its beauty. Rather like people, he thought, cleaning his brushes in turpentine that made his eyes water. That first evening established the rhythm of the house. Dinner in the vast dining room, Isabelle de Montmoreau presiding with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops, her black dress severe against her pale skin. The Lady Celeste appeared briefly, beautiful as moonlight and just as wan, excusing herself before the fish course with a whispered apology. The servants moved like shadows, present but somehow incorporeal, their voices never rising above murmurs. 3 mornings later, on the 18th of September, the artist stood before his easel as autumn light filtered through the tower windows, transforming dust motes into tiny golden planets orbiting through the still air. He had spent the intervening days preparing his canvas, mixing his medium, observing the household's peculiar rhythms, the way servants whispered in doorways, how Isabelle's keys jangled at her waist like tiny bells announcing her approach, the doctor's carriage arriving each afternoon at precisely 4 o'clock. Madame Celeste de Montmoreau entered the studio, accompanied by her lady's maid, a bright-eyed girl from Lyon named Marie-Claire, who helped arrange her mistress's dove-gray morning dress before retreating to a corner with her needlework. You would have been struck, as our artist was, by the contrast between them. The maid, rosy with health and barely suppressed energy. The mistress, pale as alabaster, moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying a bowl of water they dare not spill. "I apologize for my appearance," Celeste said, settling onto the divan. Her voice carried the faint accent of Lyon's merchant classes, not quite erased by 3 years of marriage to nobility. "The morning light is not kind to those of us suffering from the family complaint." The artist studied her face with professional detachment, noting the blue shadows beneath her eyes, the translucent quality of her skin where it stretched across her temples. Beautiful, yes, but it was beauty walking hand in hand with something else, something that whispered of endings. "The light is merely honest, madame."
It is we who choose to call it kind or cruel." She smiled at that, the expression transforming her face briefly into something altogether more vital. A philosopher who paints, or a painter who philosophizes? A craftsman who observes, nothing more. He began sketching the preliminary forms, charcoal whispering across canvas, the shape of her head, the angle of her shoulders, the way her hands folded in her lap like birds at rest. All the while he listened to the household stirring around them, footsteps on stairs, doors opening and closing, the distant clatter of the kitchen preparing luncheon. "They tell me you're from Paris," she ventured after a long silence, broken only by the scratch of charcoal and Marie Claire's needle pulling through fabric. "Originally from Troyes. My father was a clockmaker there." "And you chose paint over gears?" "Gears tell only one truth, that time passes." Paint can tell many truths, or many lies, depending on the hand that wields it. She fell silent again. But it was a different quality of silence, contemplative rather than exhausted. He began mixing flesh tones on his palette, yellow ochre, vermilion, a touch of raw umber, and of course, lead white to capture that alabaster quality of her skin. The white had an unusual sheen to it, he noticed, almost crystalline. He made a mental note to check his supplies. Perhaps the humid Loire air was affecting his pigments. "Le flétrissement familial," Marie Claire whispered to another servant who had come to tend the fire. "The family withering." The artist's French was excellent, honed by years in Parisian studios where models gossiped freely, assuming the foreign-looking painter couldn't understand. But he understood perfectly. This curse they spoke of, this gradual failing that claimed the Montmoreau women. Strange how readily people accepted curses, he thought, when simpler explanations might suffice. In Paris, he had painted factory workers' wives, their skin bearing the same translucent quality, their breath labored in the same way. But those women had worked with phosphorus in the match factories, lead in the paintworks. Their withering had a name and a cause, though it made it no less fatal. "Shall I prepare your afternoon powder, madame?" Marie Claire asked, setting aside her needlework as the bells of the village church chimed noon. "Yes, though I confess it seems to help less each day." Celeste turned to the artist. "A special preparation from Dr. Durand. He says it will restore my complexion, though I fear I am beyond such restoration." The maid departed, her footsteps quick and light on the stairs. Through the open door he could hear Isabel's voice below, sharp and commanding, directing the household with military precision. The artist continued working, building up the underlayers that would support the final image. This was always his favorite stage, when possibilities still existed, before choices became fixed in paint. "You're different from Monsieur Delacroix," Celeste observed. "He painted my cousin in Tours. He talked constantly about art, about politics, about himself mostly." "And I say too little." "You observe. I can feel you observing, even when you're looking at the canvas." She shifted slightly, wincing. "Do you see it? The withering?" He set down his brush, considering his words carefully. In his experience, the dying appreciated honesty more than comfort. "I see a young woman who rises each day despite feeling unwell, who sits for a portrait she suspects might become memorial, who maintains grace despite what I imagine is considerable discomfort." "If that is withering, madame, then perhaps we should all wither so nobly." For the first time since entering the studio, she laughed, not the polite titter of an aristocratic lady, but something genuine and surprised. "My husband would be scandalized. He hired you for flattery, not philosophy." Then he hired the wrong man. I paint what I see. Marie-Claire returned with a silver tray bearing a crystal pot of white powder and a soft brush. The artist watched as she dusted it across her mistress's face and décolletage with practiced movements. The powder had an odd scent, metallic, sharp, not unlike the smell that clung to his lead white. It settled into Celeste's skin, momentarily brightening her complexion before seeming to dull it further. "There," Marie-Claire said, though her expression suggested she saw the same thing he did, that the powder was somehow making things worse. The afternoon session continued until the light began to shift, turning golden and thick. Dr. Durand arrived for his daily visit, his heavy tread on the stairs announcing him long before his knock. A man of 55 years, prosperous and confident in the way of provincial physicians who faced little competition. He examined the work in progress with interest, capturing her very essence, I see. Though perhaps a touch more color in the cheeks. She's not as pale as you're making her. The artist did not point out that she was, in fact, exactly that pale beneath the powder. He had learned long ago that people saw what they expected to see, what they needed to see. The doctor saw a patient responding to treatment. The husband saw a wife suffering from hereditary weakness. The sister-in-law saw... What did Isabelle see, he wondered, when she looked at Celeste? As if summoned by his thoughts, Isabelle appeared in the doorway, her black dress making her seem like a piece of the gathering dusk that had torn free and taken human form. The session must end. Celeste needs her rest before dinner. There was something in the way she said it, proprietary and final, that made the artist's neck prickle with the same instinct that had saved him from a falling scaffold once in Paris. He began cleaning his brushes slowly, watching as the two women helped Celeste to her feet. She swayed slightly, one hand reaching for the door frame. "Tomorrow?" she asked. "If Madame feels strong enough," he replied. That night, unable to sleep, he examined his lead white by candlelight. The surface had definitely changed, taking on a crystalline quality he'd never seen before. He opened a fresh jar from his supplies. It looked normal, creamy and dense. He marked the new jar with a small scratch from his palette knife. By the 25th of September, the portrait had progressed beyond mere sketches to the careful application of color, each session building upon the last, like sediment accumulating at a river's bottom. Our artist had developed a routine. Arrive at the studio before dawn, prepare his pigments, await Celeste's arrival at 10, paint until the light shifted at 3. But routines, as any detective of human nature knows, are where anomalies reveal themselves. That morning, he discovered his carefully marked jar of lead white had been disturbed. The scratch remained, yes, but the consistency of the paint had changed, taking on that same crystalline quality he'd noticed before. Someone had added something to it during the night. He tested it with his palette knife. It spread differently, grainier, leaving tiny sparkles in its wake like ground glass. You might wonder why he didn't simply confront the household immediately. But our painter was cautious by nature and experience. In the Parisian studios where he'd learned his craft, he'd seen apprentices sabotage each other's work out of jealousy. Masters doctor their students' pigments to maintain superiority. Accusation without proof led nowhere pleasant. So he did what any careful craftsman would do. He began keeping 2 sets of materials, one obvious, one hidden behind a loose board he'd discovered in the tower's wainscoting. Celeste arrived that morning, supported by Marie-Claire, her weakness more pronounced despite the late September warmth streaming through the windows. The maid helped arrange her mistress on the divan, then retreated to her corner.
though the artist noticed she'd positioned herself to watch not just her needlework, but the entire room. "Monsieur," Marie-Claire ventured during a break while Celeste dozed lightly in the afternoon sun, "might I ask a favor, a small one?" He looked up from mixing a particularly delicate shade for the shadow beneath Celeste's jaw, a color that needed to suggest both beauty and fragility without tipping into morbidity. The girl stood before him, twisting her hands in her apron, youth and worry fighting for dominance in her features.
"I wondered, that is, if you might have time, could you make a small sketch of me? I could pay a little each week from my wages." There was something in her eagerness that spoke of more than simple vanity. Love, perhaps. Someone she wished to remember her by, or to remember. "Keep still," he said, reaching for his charcoal. "Turn toward the window. There, just so." He sketched quickly, capturing her round cheeks, the determined set of her chin, the way her cap couldn't quite contain her dark curls. She had the kind of face that in 20 years would be called handsome rather than pretty, but for now held all the charm of youth, believing itself immortal. "For your young man?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice below Celeste's sleeping breaths. She colored prettily. "Guillaume, the stable master. We hope to marry, once I've saved enough for a dowry. Madame has promised to help when she's well again." The last phrase carried more hope than conviction. He handed her the sketch, watched her eyes widen with wonder. People always seemed surprised when their image proved they existed, as if they doubted it until that moment. No payment necessary. Consider it practice for capturing quick expressions. Later, when Celeste woke and the session resumed, he found himself studying the interplay between mistress and maid more carefully. There was genuine affection there, the kind that develops between people who share difficult truths. Marie-Claire's attention never wavered, noting each wince, each moment when Celeste's hands trembled too much to hold their pose. "The powder again, madame?" the maid asked as the church bells chimed 2. "I suppose, though I wonder if we shouldn't try reducing the amount. I feel worse each time." "Mademoiselle Isabelle insists on the doctor's instructions exactly," Marie-Claire replied, but the artist caught the doubt in her voice. She prepared the powder with obvious reluctance, the silver brush moving across Celeste's skin like a pen, writing some terrible verdict. That afternoon, Isabelle herself appeared to inspect the portrait's progress. She moved around the easel with the critical eye of someone who understood quality without possessing the ability to create it. Her dress today was dark blue rather than black, but the effect was the same. She seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "You're capturing her well," she admitted, though it sounded like an accusation. "Perhaps too well. My brother expects a certain idealization." "I paint what I see, mademoiselle." "And what do you see?" The question had edges sharp enough to cut. He considered his words while cleaning excess paint from his palette knife. "I see a young woman of considerable beauty and grace, bearing an illness with dignity." Isabelle's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Illness? Yes, we call it that." 4 generations of Montmoreau wives, all falling to the same illness. One might think we'd learned to marry hardier stock. She moved closer to his pigments, examining them with interest. Such vivid colors. And yet they're all poison, aren't they? Your emerald green with its arsenic, your vermilion with its mercury, even your lead white so essential for capturing light. Beauty and death mixed together on your palate. All things are poison in sufficient quantity, mademoiselle. Even water can drown. How philosophical. I suppose artists must be, spending so much time observing life rather than living it. She picked up his jar of lead white, the one he'd deliberately left obvious, turning it in the light. This has an unusual quality. Where do you source your pigments? Various suppliers in Paris. This particular white comes from the ancient method, lead strips exposed to vinegar vapors.
Some modern manufacturers add compounds to prevent caking in humid conditions. She set it down precisely where she'd found it, though he noticed she'd gotten some on her fingers. She rubbed them together absently, as if testing the texture. Fascinating. Well, don't let me disturb your work. Celeste needs these sessions. They seem to give her purpose. After she left, he made another sketch in his private notebook. Not of faces this time, but of hand positions. The way Isabel had held the jar, the particular angle of her fingers as she'd tested the paint. Details mattered. His father had taught him that, showing him how a clock's failure could always be traced to one small gear, one tiny spring that had shifted from its proper place. That evening, unable to sleep again, he climbed to his studio and discovered something curious. His marked jar had been opened again, but this time someone had added a different substance. He touched a tiny amount to his tongue, a metallic bitterness that made him spit immediately. Not just lead white anymore, but lead white mixed with something else, something that increased its toxicity exponentially. Sugar of lead, perhaps. The sweet poison that had killed Romans in their wine, that some women still use to whiten their skin despite the danger. He thought of Celeste's powder, its metallic scent, the way it seemed to dull her skin rather than brighten it. He thought of Marie Claire's reluctance to apply it, of Isabel's insistence on following the doctor's instructions exactly. He thought of the portrait gallery downstairs, all those young women with their abbreviated dates, their resigned expressions. A pattern was emerging, like an image appearing through layers of glaze. Not clear yet, but beginning to take shape. He replaced his doctored lead white with fresh paint from his hidden supply, then marked the new jar with a different scratch, a tiny cross this time. Let them think he hadn't noticed. Let them continue their alterations while he documented each change. Through his window, he could see lights still burning in the chateau's main wing. Someone else was wakeful tonight. He wondered if it was Celeste, struggling to breathe in her bed, or Isabel, planning tomorrow's household management, or perhaps Dr. Durand, preparing his compounds and powders, secure in his medical knowledge. The 2nd of October arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind that makes wine ferment too quickly and sets everyone's nerves on edge. Our artist had been at the chateau for over 2 weeks now, long enough to understand its rhythms, the morning prayers, led by Father Antoine, the afternoon medical visits, the evening silences that fell like curtains between the inhabitants. But this afternoon would prove different. Dr. Laurent Durand arrived earlier than usual, his carriage wheels crunching on the gravel drive just past noon. From his tower window, the artist watched the physician descend, noting how he paused to steady himself against the carriage door. The good doctor had been sampling something stronger than water with his midday meal, it seemed. Such observations matter when one is trying to understand the machinery of a household, the small failures that might explain larger disasters. The portrait session had been canceled that morning, Celeste too weak to leave her bed.
So our painter used the time to organize his materials and continue his documentation. He'd begun keeping a journal in cipher, a simple substitution code his father had taught him for recording valuable clock mechanisms. Each alteration to his paints, each overhead conversation, each telling glance between household members found its place in those coded pages. "You there, artist!" The doctor's voice boomed up the stairwell. "Come down, would you?" "I require an objective eye." Curious and sensing opportunity, he descended to find Durand in the small salon that had been converted to a consultation room. The doctor stood beside a table laden with glass bottles and ceramic jars, his usually steady hands showing the faintest tremor. The smell of alcohol on his breath confirmed the earlier suspicion, but there was something else there too, the sour scent of fear. "Tell me," Durand said without preamble, "you've seen many people in your profession, many faces, many conditions. What do you make of Madame de Montmoreau's appearance?" The artist considered his response carefully. Drunk men often spoke truths they'd never voice sober, but they also remembered slights with surprising clarity. "She presents symptoms I've seen before in Paris, among women who worked in certain factories." "Factories?" The doctor laughed bitterly. "She's never been near a factory in her life. This is the hereditary Montmoreau weakness, nothing more. I've treated 3 of them now. Henri's mother, his first wife, now Celeste. The symptoms are always the same." He picked up a blue bottle, swirling its contents. "Mercury compounds for the nervous symptoms. Absolutely standard treatment." "And the powder?" Durand's eyes sharpened despite the wine. "What about the powder?" "I've observed its application seems to coincide with her worst periods. Coincidence, nothing more. The powder is my own formulation. Lead carbonate for whitening, a touch of bismuth for shimmer, rice powder as a base. Perfectly safe in the prescribed amounts." He set the bottle down too hard, making the others rattle. "Do you know what they pay me? 50 francs a month plus supplies. Enough to maintain appearances, not enough to satisfy creditors." The artist filed this information away. A man in debt was a man susceptible to pressure, to looking the other way when convenient. "Creditors can be demanding," he offered neutrally. "You have no idea." Durand slumped into a chair. "The gaming tables at Tours. I was certain my system would work. Mathematics, you understand. Probability. But the dice don't care about probability when you need them to." He looked up suddenly, his bloodshot eyes focusing with effort. "You won't mention this conversation to Monsieur de Montmoreau. I'm here to paint, nothing more. Good man." The doctor began preparing his medical bag with the careful movements of someone trying to appear more sober than they were. "I should tell you something, though. Professional courtesy, one observer to another. The women who marry into this family don't last long. It's not natural what happens to them. But every time I suggest sending Madame to Paris to specialists, Mademoiselle Isabelle insists the family has always been treated here with traditional methods. And you comply?" "And I comply." The words carried the weight of years of small compromises. "She controls the household purse, you see. Henri leaves all such matters to her, and she's very particular about following established treatments. Very particular indeed." Later that afternoon, having obtained permission to sketch in the gardens for landscape backgrounds, The artist positioned himself where he could observe Celeste's windows. He watched Marie Claire come and go, watched Dr. Durand's unsteady progress to the sick room, watched Isabel's black figure sweep through the corridors like a chess piece claiming squares. The treatment session lasted an hour. Through the open window, he could hear Celeste's weak protests, the doctor's professional reassurances, Isabel's firm insistence that the full dose be administered. When Marie Claire emerged to empty a basin, her face was tight with suppressed emotion. She spotted the artist and approached, glancing back to ensure she wasn't observed. "She's getting worse," the girl whispered. "Every day, despite the treatments." "Perhaps because of them." "What do you think?" Marie Claire bit her lip, then seemed to make a decision. "In Lyon, in my grandmother's time, women used such powders to whiten their skin. Many sickened. Some died. The symptoms were similar, the weakness, the tremors, the difficulty breathing. And yet you continue to apply the powder." Mademoiselle Isabelle watches. She counts the applications, measures the amount used. She says it's to ensure the treatment is followed precisely. Marie Claire glanced around again. "But I've begun using less than prescribed, pretending to apply more than I do. It's the only small rebellion I can manage." That evening, the artist dined alone, the family occupied with Celeste's crisis. The servants spoke freely, perhaps forgetting he understood their patois perfectly. They discussed the similar crisis that had preceded the first Madame de Montmoreau's death, the way she'd rallied briefly before the end, how Isabelle had nursed her with such dedication that Henri had wept with gratitude. "And now she nurses another one toward the grave," muttered the cook, an elderly woman who'd been with the family 40 years. "Hush," warned the butler. "Walls have ears." "And portraits have eyes," the cook replied, glancing meaningfully at the artist. "Some see more than others." He pretended absorption in his meal, but his mind was working, assembling pieces like his father, fitting gears into a clock movement. The doctor, compromised by debt. Isabelle, controlling treatments with iron determination. The powder, so similar to the cosmetic poisons that had killed women throughout history. And Celeste, growing weaker with each application, each treatment designed to cure. That night he conducted an experiment. Taking a small amount of the altered lead white from his jar, he mixed it with water and applied it to a piece of raw meat he'd saved from dinner. Within hours, the flesh had begun to discolor, taking on a grayish tinge that spoke of corruption. Whatever had been added to his paint was aggressive, designed to destroy rather than preserve. He thought of the portrait taking shape on his easel, Celeste's face emerging from the canvas like a truth being slowly revealed. Every artist knew that lead white was the foundation of light in oil painting, the substance that made luminosity possible. But lead was also the foundation of many poisons, the sweet-tasting killer that had destroyed empires from within. Through his window he could see Dr. Durand's carriage still in the courtyard, the man himself likely sleeping off his wine in some guest chamber. Tomorrow there would be more treatments, more powder, more of Isabelle's careful supervision. Unless someone intervened. But intervention required proof, and proof required patience. His father had taught him that too. A clock's mystery could only be solved by understanding each component's function. He was beginning to understand this household's mechanism, but he didn't yet comprehend the mainspring, the driving force that kept this deadly routine in motion. The 10th of October brought rain to the Loire Valley. the kind that turns paths to mud and keeps everyone indoors nursing their particular discontents. Our artist had planned this day carefully, waiting for just such weather when the household would be distracted by leaking roofs and blocked drains. Chaos, he'd learned, was often the best cover for investigation. The morning began with shouting from the kitchen. A chimney had backed up, filling the servants' quarters with smoke. While Isabel marshaled the staff to address this crisis, and Henri rode to Tours on business despite the weather, the artist made his way to the one room he'd been explicitly told to avoid, the family archives. You might wonder at his boldness, this painter who had been so cautious until now. But 3 weeks of watching Celeste fade like a flower cut from its root had worn away his professional detachment. Some truths demand to be uncovered, regardless of the risk to the one who wields the spade. The archive room occupied a corner of the second floor, its door locked with an ancient mechanism that would have amused his clockmaker father. Such locks relied on weight and leverage rather than precision. A bent palette knife and patience sufficed to overcome it. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of old paper and leather, centuries of family history moldering quietly in the dark. He lit a lamp and began his search methodically, starting with the most recent records. Marriage contracts, death certificates, household accounts, all the bureaucracy that accumulated around lives like sediment. The pattern emerged quickly once you knew what to look for. Montmoreau wives, going back 70 years, rarely survived their 4th anniversary. Always the same symptoms noted: weakness, pallor, difficulty breathing, tremors. Always the same cause listed: hereditary female weakness of the Montmoreau line. But then he found something interesting. A letter dated 1794 during the Terror. The writer, one Citizen Montmoreau, they'd dropped the de for safety, wrote to his brother about narrowly escaping the guillotine. The family fortune, he noted with satisfaction, remained intact thanks to his late wife's convenient death from sudden illness just before she could be questioned about hidden gold. Our family physician proved most accommodating, the letter concluded, understanding that preservation of the estate benefits all. Another document, from 1823, discussed Isabel's own broken engagement. The young man, a cavalry officer named Beaumont, had lost his fortune in a failed speculation. Isabel's father had forbidden the match, and Beaumont had died shortly after in a duel that, reading between the lines, seemed suspiciously convenient. Isabel had never shown interest in another suitor, dedicating herself instead to managing the household with increasing authority. Finding anything interesting? The voice froze his blood. Marie-Claire stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. For a moment, they regarded each other like duelists measuring distance. The door was open, he lied. No, it wasn't. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. But I won't tell if you won't. I've been wanting to look in here myself. Why? She moved to another shelf, running her fingers along the spines. My mistress asked me to research something, quietly. She's begun to suspect her illness isn't natural, but she needs proof before confronting her husband. Marie-Claire pulled out a ledger. Look at this. Household expenses for 1831, the year the first Madame de Montmoreau died. Together they examined the accounts. Regular purchases of lead carbonate, mercury compounds, and something called Venetian ceruse, all common cosmetic ingredients, all potentially toxic in large doses. The quantities ordered increased steadily over the final year of the first wife's life. "The same pattern as now," Marie Claire observed. "The treatments intensify as the patient weakens, which makes the weakness worse, which justifies more treatment." A commotion from below interrupted them, voices raised in argument.
They quickly replaced the documents and slipped from the room, the artist pocketing a few key pages he couldn't resist taking. In the main hall, they found an unexpected scene. Isabel confronting a young man in muddy riding clothes, his face flushed with anger or exertion. "You have no business here," Isabel was saying, her voice arctic. "I have every business here. Celeste is my cousin. Her mother wrote that she's gravely ill." The young man, he couldn't have been more than 25, stood his ground despite Isabel's formidable presence. "I demand to see her." Henri had returned from Tours, his clothes sodden with rain. "What's this about? I am Philippe Mercier from Lyon, Celeste's cousin on her mother's side." The young man turned to Henri with barely contained fury. "I've heard disturbing reports about my cousin's health. In Lyon, we know something of how your family treats its wives." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Henry's hand moved to his sword hilt, an antiquated gesture, but no less threatening for it. "You dare insult my family's honor?" "I dare speak truth. 3 wives dead in 4 generations, all from the same mysterious illness. In Lyon, we call that suspicious, not unfortunate." Isabel stepped between them with the smooth authority of someone used to managing male tempers. "Your cousin is receiving the finest medical care. Dr. Durand attends her daily. She wants for nothing." "Except health," Philippe shot back. "I insist on seeing her." "Tomorrow," Henri said coldly. "You may visit tomorrow, briefly. Tonight, you'll return to Tours. This house offers no hospitality to those who cast aspersions on its honor." After Philippe's reluctant departure, the household buzzed with tension. The artist returned to his studio, but concentration proved impossible. Through his window, he watched Isabel in intense conversation with Dr. Durand in the garden, their figures dark against the silver rain. Whatever they discussed required gesticulation and what appeared to be threats on both sides. That evening, Marie Claire came to the studio on pretext of bringing fresh candles. "Madame wants to see you," she whispered. "Tonight, after the house sleeps. She has questions only you might answer." The prospect was dangerous. Being found in a lady's chambers at night meant scandal at best, a duel at worst. But Celeste deserved truth, and truth sometimes required risk. He agreed with a nod. As he waited for the household to settle, he mixed a special batch of lead white, pure and untainted, alongside the poisoned version. Tomorrow he would need to demonstrate the difference, to show someone in authority how the cosmetic powder was being adulterated. The cousin's arrival had provided an unexpected ally, someone outside the household's careful machinery who might believe what others would deny. He thought of Isabel's broken engagement, of the family fortune that would dissipate if divided among heirs, of the convenient deaths that had preserved the estate intact for generations. The powerful, he'd learned, would do anything to remain powerful. They would sacrifice love, honor, even family to maintain their position. And they would always find physicians, servants, artists even, willing to look away for the right price or pressure. But not this time. Not while he still had paint and canvas
and the ability to capture truth in pigment and oil. The portrait on his easel had become more than a commission. It was evidence, each brushstroke documenting Celeste's unnecessary suffering, each layer revealing the crime being committed in plain sight. The 18th of October dawned crisp and clear, one of those autumn mornings when the Loire Valley seemed painted in shades of gold and rust.
Our artist had been awake since 3, carefully preparing his materials for what he knew would be a decisive day. The pure chalk powder he'd ground himself lay hidden in a cosmetic pot, identical to the one containing Celeste's prescribed powder, a pot he'd purchased in Tours, claiming it was for mixing pigments. You see, sometimes the greatest rebellions are the quietest ones, accomplished not with swords or proclamations, but with simple substitutions. One powder for another. Health for harm. He'd made his decision after the midnight meeting with Celeste 8 days prior, when she'd whispered through tears that she could feel herself dying, could feel it in her bones like winter settling into the stones of the chateau. Marie-Claire had become his accomplice in this gentle conspiracy, though neither spoke of it directly. She would leave the powder unattended for precisely 3 minutes each morning while fetching fresh water. Enough time for a quick exchange if one moved with purpose. This morning would be their 4th such switch, and already the results were visible to anyone who cared to look. The portrait sessions had resumed, with Celeste showing marked improvement. Color had returned to her cheeks, not the hectic flush of fever, but the gentle pink of returning health. Her hands had stopped trembling. She could sit for 2 hours now without exhaustion. Henri had even commented on it at dinner, expressing hope that perhaps the family curse was loosening its grip. "You're capturing her beautifully," Isabelle said, appearing in the studio doorway like a shadow given form. She moved around the easel, studying the work with her characteristic intensity, perhaps too beautifully. "She doesn't look this well in life." The artist continued painting, adding highlights to the pearl necklace at Celeste's throat. "Light changes everything, mademoiselle. Northern light especially can be flattering." "Light," she repeated, moving closer to his pigments. "And yet you work with such toxic materials. I've been reading about painters' ailments. The mad episodes from lead exposure, the tremors from mercury. You must be very careful with your materials." She picked up his jar of lead white, the poisoned one he kept visible for her inspection. He'd been documenting its changes, noting how someone added new substances every few days, increasing its toxicity. Today it contained what he suspected was white arsenic mixed with the lead, enough to kill if ingested or absorbed through skin over time. "I am always careful, mademoiselle." "Are you?" She dipped her finger into the paint, rubbing it between thumb and forefinger. "This has an unusual texture." "Gritty, almost crystalline. The humidity affects the binding. I may need to acquire fresh supplies from Paris." Her smile was thin as paper. "That won't be necessary. I'm sure we can source what you need locally. Dr. Durand has excellent suppliers for his compounds, the same ones who provide my dear sister-in-law's cosmetics." There it was, as close to an admission as he would likely get. She knew. Of course she knew. The question was whether she was architect or accomplice, primary poisoner, or merely someone who ensured others' work continued unimpeded. That afternoon, he worked on 2 portraits simultaneously, the official one showing Celeste as she appeared when ill, and a secret one, painted during stolen hours, showing her as she was becoming with the poison removed. The second portrait lived behind a false backing he'd constructed, invisible unless you knew where to look. Evidence, his father would have called it. Documentation of a crime and its remedy.
Philippe Mercier visited again that day, having established himself at an inn in Tours despite Henri's hostility. The young man possessed the irritating persistence of someone with both righteousness and resources on his side. He spent an hour with Celeste, then sought out the artist in his studio. "She looks better," Philippe said without preamble. "Markedly better than my aunt's letters suggested. What's changed?" The artist considered his response carefully. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but sometimes calculated risks were necessary. Perhaps the autumn air agrees with her. "Don't insult my intelligence." Philippe moved closer, lowering his voice. "I've made inquiries in the village. You're not the first artist to paint a Marmoreau bride. The last one, a Monsieur Delacroix from Orléans, left abruptly after the previous Madame's death. He told people in Tours that he'd seen things, suspected things, but had no proof." "And what do you suspect, monsieur?" "I suspect that my cousin is being poisoned, likely through her cosmetics or medications. I suspect this has happened before, multiple times. And I suspect you know more than you're saying." The artist set down his brush, meeting the young man's gaze directly. Sometimes, when the machinery of crime was too well oiled, you needed someone willing to throw a wrench into the gears. "If one suspected such a thing, one would need proof, documentation, evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. And if one had such evidence, one might share it with someone who had both the standing and the motivation to act on it. Someone whose family connections in Lyon might carry more weight than a humble painter's observations." Philippe understood immediately. "Tomorrow." "Can you have this evidence ready by tomorrow?" Before the artist could respond, footsteps echoed on the stairs. Multiple people, moving with purpose. Isabelle entered first, followed by Dr. Durand and, surprisingly, Henri himself. The doctor carried his medical bag, his face grim. "There's been a development," Henri announced. "Father Antoine reports 3 deaths in the village this week, all showing similar symptoms to Celeste's illness. We fear some kind of contagion. Therefore," Isabelle continued smoothly, "we must increase Celeste's treatments immediately. Double doses of all medications, more frequent applications of the protective powder. We cannot risk losing her to this plague." The artist saw the trap immediately. Under the guise of protection, they would accelerate the poisoning. And with village deaths to point to, any deterioration in Celeste's condition would be blamed on contagion rather than murder. Brilliant, in its horrible way. "I'll prepare the new prescriptions immediately," Dr. Durand said, though something in his expression suggested reluctance. The man was weak, not evil, the artist realized. Controlled by debt and fear rather than malice. After they left, Philippe gripped the artist's arm. "We can't wait until tomorrow." "No," the artist agreed, "we cannot." That evening, while the household prepared for increased medical vigilance, the artist made his own preparations. He mixed a new batch of harmless powder, enough to last weeks. He prepared his evidence, the documented changes to his paints, the journal entries in cipher, the 2 portraits that showed the truth of Celeste's condition. And he wrote a letter to a friend in Paris, a journalist who specialized in exposing society scandals, detailing everything he'd observed. The substitution would continue, but now with higher stakes. Every exchange of powder was a small revolution.
Every improvement in Celeste's health a victory against the machinery of murder that had run smoothly for generations. But machines, as his father had taught him, were only as strong as their weakest component. The 25th of October began with frost on the windows and ended with truth laid bare like a cadaver on an anatomist's table. Our artist had risen early to make another powder substitution, but found Isabel waiting in the studio, holding the cosmetic pot he'd so carefully prepared. The morning light streaming through the tower windows illuminated her face with cruel clarity. Every line earned through years of managing, manipulating, maintaining. "Chalk," she said simply, rubbing the powder between her fingers. "Common chalk, ground fine. You must think me very stupid, monsieur." The game, as they say in chess, had moved to its end game. He set down his palette knife slowly, considering his options. Denial seemed pointless. She held the evidence in her hands. "I think you very intelligent, mademoiselle. Intelligent enough to have orchestrated similar substitutions for decades," she laughed, a sound like ice cracking on a pond. "Orchestrated? You give me too much credit. I merely ensure the family traditions continue uninterrupted." She moved to the window, looking out over the estate's vineyards, now bare and skeletal in autumn's grip. "Do you know what this land is worth? Not in francs, but in centuries of cultivation, generations of knowledge, bloodlines that stretch back to Charlemagne." "Worth 4 women's lives, apparently." "4?" She turned genuinely amused. "Oh, my dear artist, you've only counted this century. The Montmoreau brides have been dying young since before the Revolution. It's simply what happens. Weak blood, they used to call it. Constitutional insufficiency. The physicians have different names for it each generation, but the outcome remains the same." She moved to his easel, studying the portrait with professional appreciation. You had to admire her composure, the way she discussed murder as another might discuss wine cultivation or household accounts. This was a woman who'd made peace with her choices long ago, or perhaps had never seen them as choices at all. "Henri doesn't know," the artist said. It wasn't quite a question. "Henri knows what he needs to know, that his family's fortune remains intact, that the estate passes unburdened to each generation, that wives who die young and childless can't claim inheritance or divide the property among heirs." She traced a finger along the portrait's frame. "He grieves beautifully, my brother, so sincere in his sorrow. It would be cruel to burden him with details. And Dr. Durand provides exactly what I request. Venetian ceruse for complexion, white lead for pallor, a touch of arsenic for that ethereal translucency. All common cosmetic ingredients, you understand. If applied in slightly stronger concentrations than usual, well, who's to say what's therapeutic and what's toxic? The line is so very thin." The artist felt his anger rising, but kept his voice level. "Celeste is recovering. Her cousin has noticed. Questions will be asked." "Yes, young Philippe. So passionate, so righteous. Did you know he's been spreading his suspicions in Tours? Making inquiries about previous Montmoreau wives? Asking about death certificates, burial records?" She returned to the cosmetic pot, setting it down with deliberate care. Such a tragedy, what happened to him last night. The blood in his veins turned to ice water. "What have you done?" "I?
Nothing. But the roads near Tours are dangerous in autumn. Rain makes them slippery. Bandits prey on travelers.
A young man riding alone at night, perhaps having drunk too much at a tavern, attempting to return to his inn, she shrugged with theatrical regret. His horse returned riderless this morning. They're searching the river now. Before he could respond, footsteps pounded up the stairs. Marie-Claire burst in, her face streaked with tears. "Madame is asking for you," she gasped, looking at the artist. "She's heard about her cousin. The shock has brought on a severe attack." Isabelle smiled thinly. How unfortunate. Stress can be so dangerous for those with delicate constitutions. "You should go to her, monsieur, to say goodbye." The walk to Celeste's chambers felt eternal. Each step weighted with the knowledge of what Isabelle had revealed. Not just murder, but systematic murder, generational murder. Murder as inheritance strategy. The portraits in the gallery weren't just paintings but tombstones, each one marking another woman sacrificed to preserve wealth and status. Celeste lay propped against pillows, her recent improvement seemingly reversed by shock and grief. But when Marie-Claire closed the door, leaving them alone, she struggled to sit up, her eyes blazing with something beyond illness. "Philippe isn't dead," she whispered urgently. "He suspected something like this might happen. The rider last night was a decoy, a friend from Lyon. Philippe is hiding at the mill house, gathering evidence with the magistrate from Tours." Relief flooded through him like warm wine. The young man had been cleverer than any of them had credited. Then Isabelle has overplayed her hand. "More than that." Celeste gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Marie-Claire has been collecting the poisoned powders instead of disposing of them. Every contaminated pot, every altered medication. Philippe has taken them to a chemist in Tours for analysis. We have proof." But will anyone believe it?
Your husband's family has influence, connections, which is why we need your testimony. The portrait tells its own story, the progression of illness, the changes that correspond with increased treatments. You're a neutral observer, a professional hired to document. Your word carries weight, mine cannot. He thought of Isabelle in the tower, so confident in her control, unaware that her machinery was already falling apart. But cornered animals were dangerous, and Isabelle was far from stupid. She knows I've been switching the powders. She'll move against us soon. Tonight, Celeste agreed. Philippe returns tonight with the magistrate and soldiers. We need only survive until then. That afternoon passed with excruciating tension. The artist returned to his studio to find his poisoned lead white missing, his cipher journal gone. Isabelle was removing evidence, preparing her defense or her flight. He continued painting as if nothing had changed, adding final touches to the portrait that had become both artwork and evidence. Dr. Durand appeared near sunset, his medical bag heavy in his shaking hands. "Mademoiselle Isabelle insists on a special treatment," he said, not meeting the artist's eyes. "A stronger dose," she says, "to combat the contagion." "You know what you're doing is murder." The doctor's composure cracked slightly. "I know I owe 3,000 francs to men who will destroy me if I don't pay. I know Isabelle holds notes that could send me to prison. I know that sometimes survival requires terrible choices." He paused at the door. "Tell Madame to refuse the medicine. Claim religious concerns, female modesty, anything. Just don't let her take what I'm about to prepare. A warning, then. Even the doctor had limits to his complicity. The artist descended to the main floor, where he found Henri in his study, staring at a miniature portrait of his first wife.
For a moment, the man looked older than his 45 years, worn down by losses he didn't fully understand. "Your sister is poisoning your wife," the artist said quietly. Henri's head snapped up, his hand moving instinctively to his sword. "How dare you? The cosmetics are contaminated with lead and arsenic. The medicines contain mercury in toxic doses. Every Momoro bride for generations has been murdered to preserve the estate from division. Your sister has all but confessed it to me." The transformation in Henri's face was terrible to witness. Disbelief giving way to recognition, recognition to horror. Because somewhere beneath the willing blindness he'd known, perhaps not the details but the pattern, the convenient deaths that prevented messy inheritances, the family fortune that remained mysteriously intact despite France's inheritance laws. The 1st of November dawned gray and bitter, frost etching patterns on the windows like accusations written in ice. Our artist found himself in Henri's study, standing beside Philippe Mercier, miraculously alive, despite Isabelle's confident announcement of his death, while a magistrate from Tours examined the array of evidence spread across the desk. Each item told its part of the story: contaminated cosmetics, doctored medicines, the artist's careful documentation, and the chemist's damning analysis confirming toxic levels of lead, mercury, and arsenic. Henri sat behind his desk like a man watching his world collapse brick by brick. You could actually see him reconsidering every family death, every convenient inheritance, every word of comfort his sister had offered during his times of grief. Truth has this quality. It rewrites the past as surely as it shapes the future. "The evidence is overwhelming," Magistrate Fouché said, his voice dry as autumn leaves. He was a methodical man who treated facts like sacred objects. Multiple deaths following identical patterns, all treated with increasingly toxic substances. This powder alone contains enough lead carbonate to cause slow systemic poisoning. The study door opened without ceremony. Isabelle entered in her characteristic black, surveying the assembled group with remarkable composure. Her gaze lingered on Philippe, and something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or admiration for his deception. "An impressive gathering. I assume there's a purpose?" "You stand accused of murder," Fouché stated formally. "Multiple counts spanning years." Her laugh was crystalline without warmth. "How dramatic." "I've never harmed anyone. I've simply maintained family traditions. The same cosmetics our women have used for generations. The same medical treatments any physician would prescribe." She turned to Dr. Durand, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Doctor, have I ever asked you to poison anyone?" Durand's reply emerged strangled. "You specified particular compounds, particular strengths, all within medical norms, surely. If patients responded poorly, that's hardly criminal. Medicine is an imperfect science." She moved toward the window with studied grace. What court would convict a spinster who spent her life caring for family, who nursed the sick with such dedication that everyone, including you, Henri, praised my devotion? The artist cleared his throat. "There are the portraits." The room's attention shifted to him. He continued calmly, with the same precision he used when mixing pigments. "I've documented Madame de Montmoreau's decline and recovery in paint.
One portrait shows her during the poisoning, another during her recovery once the toxins were removed. The progression is undeniable, evidence that speaks without words. For the first time, Isabel's mask slipped. Paintings? You'd present paintings as evidence? Art is interpretation, not fact. When combined with chemical analysis, witness testimony, and documented observations, they become fact, Philippe interjected firmly. They prove the attempted murder of my cousin. Henri finally found his voice, though it emerged broken. Why, Isabel? We had enough. We've always had enough. She regarded her brother with something approaching pity. You never understood, did you? The new inheritance laws, the division of estates, the claims wives could make on family property. One generation of children could destroy what took centuries to build. I preserved our legacy, Henri. I did what our father did, what his father did before him. Father never, didn't he? Why do you think Mother died so young? Why did her family never visit? Why did Father burn all her letters? Isabel's smile was sharp as glass. I didn't invent this tradition, brother. I merely refined it. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that falls after terrible truths are spoken. Dr. Durand suddenly stepped forward, producing a sheaf of papers from his coat. I kept records, he said, voice trembling. Every prescription she demanded, every compound she specified, every time she overruled my medical judgment. I knew something was wrong, but she held my debts, threatened to ruin me. Coward, Isabel said softly, but without real venom. She could see her carefully constructed mechanism falling apart, each piece failing in sequence. The magistrate began formal arrest procedures, but the artist found himself watching Henri. The man seemed to age before their eyes, his understanding of his life, his family, his very identity crumbling like old mortar. When Celeste entered, supported by Marie-Claire, but notably stronger than she'd been in weeks, Henri's face crumpled entirely. I didn't know, he whispered to his wife. I swear to you, I didn't know. Celeste studied him with eyes that had seen too much. You didn't want to know. That's not the same as innocence. As the constables prepared to lead Isabel away, she paused near the artist. You think you've won? This family's poison runs deeper than any cosmetic. It's in the stones, the soil, the blood itself. You've only delayed the inevitable corruption. Perhaps there was truth in her words. The chateau did feel contaminated, heavy with the weight of generations of women sacrificed to preserve wealth. But the artist knew from his work that even the most toxic pigments could be contained, diluted, neutralized with proper knowledge and care. The following days blurred together. Depositions, investigations, the slow machinery of justice grinding forward. The chateau filled with officials cataloging evidence, interviewing servants, exhuming bodies for examination. Each revelation added another layer to the horror, another generation of murders disguised as illness. But life, stubborn as weeds and pavement, continued. Celeste grew stronger each day without the poisoned cosmetics. Marie-Claire married her stablemaster in a quiet ceremony in the village church. Dr. Durand, broken by guilt and facing his own legal consequences, provided detailed testimony that would ensure Isabel's conviction. The artist continued painting, because that's what artists do. They document, they witness, they preserve truth in pigment and oil. The portrait of Celeste was nearly complete now, showing a woman who had survived what shouldn't have been survivable, who had walked through poison and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least alive. The 8th of November brought unexpected warmth to the Loire Valley, what the locals called Été de la Saint-Martin, those last golden days before winter's grip tightened. Our artist stood before his easel in the tower studio, adding final touches to Celeste's portrait while she sat for what would be their last session. The light streaming through the windows had that peculiar quality of autumn afternoons, simultaneously bright and melancholic, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories made visible. Celeste had transformed remarkably in the week since Isabelle's arrest. Color had returned to her cheeks without the aid of any powder, her hands steady as she held the pose, her breathing deep and even. Recovery, the artist had observed, was its own kind of artistry, the body repainting itself in healthier hues, erasing the damage, stroke by patient stroke. "I received a letter from the magistrate this morning," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had developed between them over these many sessions. "Isabelle has confessed to everything. Not just my poisoning, but Marguerite's death, Henri's mother, even an aunt from 30 years ago." She kept journals, apparently, detailed records of doses, effects, modifications to the formula over time. The artist paused in his work, considering this. It fit with what he'd observed of Isabelle, that peculiar combination of methodical planning and absolute conviction in her own righteousness. She saw herself as a guardian of the family legacy. She saw herself as judge and executioner, Celeste corrected, though without heat. "But I find I can't entirely hate her. Is that strange?" She was trapped, too, in her way. Raised to believe the estate mattered more than any individual life, trained from birth to be its protector. Through the window they could see the vineyard workers finishing the late harvest, their voices carrying on the warm air. The estate would continue, though its future remained uncertain. Henri had spoken of selling, of starting fresh, somewhere unmarked by generations of death, but Celeste had surprised everyone by refusing. "This land has seen enough running away," she'd said. "Someone needs to stay and make amends." Marie-Claire entered with afternoon tea, her movements light with the particular happiness of young love fulfilled. Her wedding ring caught the light as she poured, a simple band, nothing like the elaborate jewels that adorned the portraits downstairs, but worn with more joy than those dead women had likely ever known. "Monsieur Philippe has arrived," she announced. "He's in the library with the master, discussing the estate's future management." Philippe had proven himself remarkably capable in the crisis's aftermath, helping Henri navigate the legal complexities while shielding Celeste from the worst of the scandal. The newspapers in Paris had seized on the story with predictable enthusiasm. The poisoned brides of Montmoreau had become the sensation of the season. But here in the chateau, life had found a quieter rhythm. The artist applied a final highlight to the pearl necklace in the portrait, then stepped back to evaluate the whole. The woman on the canvas looked back at him with eyes that had seen death approach and retreat, that held knowledge no one should have to carry, but that she bore with grace. It was, he thought, perhaps his finest work, not for its technical excellence, though he had taken particular care with every brushstroke, but for what it had witnessed and documented. "It's finished?" Celeste asked, rising to look. "A portrait is never truly finished," he replied, cleaning his brush with the careful movements of ritual. "But yes, this one has said what it needed to say." She studied her painted self for a long moment. "You've made me beautiful." "I've painted what was there. Beauty that survives poisoning has a particular quality, tested, proven, genuine. The cosmetic beauty Isabel was trying to destroy was always false. This is truth. Henri entered then, looking older but somehow lighter, as if confession had physically reduced his burden. He stopped short at seeing the completed portrait, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. "It's remarkable," he said finally. "She looks alive." "That was the point," the artist said dryly. An awkward silence fell, the kind that would probably always exist between them now. The painter who'd saved Henri's wife and exposed his sister. The husband who'd been willfully blind to murder in his own home. But Henri, to his credit, didn't try to fill it with empty words. Instead, he pulled out a heavy purse. "Your fee, as agreed, plus a substantial addition for services beyond the original commission." The artist weighed the purse without opening it. More than generous, enough to keep him comfortable in Paris for a year, maybe two. Blood money, some might call it, but he'd earned it honestly. "Thank you." "I've had your belongings packed," Henri continued, clearly eager to conclude this chapter. "The carriage will take you to Tours tomorrow, where you can catch the diligence to Paris." "Actually," Celeste interjected, "I've asked Monsieur to create one more piece before he leaves. A small portrait of Marie-Claire and Guillaume. A wedding gift." The artist nodded agreement. He'd already sketched them during the ceremony, captured the way they looked at each other with uncomplicated devotion. It would be a pleasure to paint something so purely joyful after weeks of documenting poison and decay. That evening, the household gathered for dinner in the small dining room. The great hall had been closed, its portraits of dead brides too oppressive for daily life. Dr. Durand was absent, under house arrest awaiting trial. Father Antoine said grace with more feeling than usual, perhaps recognizing how close they'd all come to presiding over another funeral. The conversation was stilted at first, everyone carefully avoiding the obvious topics. But Philippe, with the social grace that would serve him well as the estate's new manager, steered them toward safer waters. Plans for the spring planting, repairs needed in the village church, a new school Celeste wanted to establish for the workers' children. "Education is the only true antidote to ignorance," she said, with a meaningful look at Henri. "If people understand what they're seeing, they're less likely to accept family traditions without question." After dinner, the artist climbed once more to his tower studio. Tomorrow he would leave this place, return to Paris with its familiar streets and anonymous faces. But tonight he wanted to fix this view in his memory. The Loire winding silver in the moonlight, the village lights like scattered stars, the chateau itself brooding, but no longer malevolent. He thought about Isabel's warning that the poison ran too deep to ever be fully purged. Perhaps she was right in a sense. The past couldn't be undone, the dead couldn't be restored, the years of suffering couldn't be erased. But poison, he knew from his work with pigments, lost its potency over time. Exposed to air and light, even the deadliest compounds eventually broke down into harmless residue. His father would have appreciated the metaphor, time as the ultimate solvent, dissolving even the most toxic traditions. The clockmaker had understood that while you couldn't reverse time's passage, you could reset the mechanism, start the counting fresh. That's what Celeste and Henri were attempting, whether they succeeded or not. The 15th of November delivered our artist to the muddy crossroads where this tale began, though now he traveled in the opposite direction, Paris-bound in a crowded diligence that smelled of wet wool and tobacco.
Through rain-streaked windows, the Loire Valley dissolved into watercolor impressions, each village and vineyard blurring into memory. 3 months would pass before the letter in his pocket would be written, yet he carried it now, Celeste's future testimony that life had triumphed over slow murder. You see how time folds upon itself in such stories? The past haunts the present. The future reaches back to comfort us. And somewhere between memory and hope, we find ourselves suspended, like paint between palette and canvas. His fellow travelers dozed or played cards, unaware they shared their journey with someone who'd helped dismantle a murder machine that had run for generations. A merchant from Tours complained about the weather's effect on wine prices. 2 priests discussed theological minutiae. Normal life continuing its normal course, oblivious to the extraordinary that had brushed against it. The letter from Celeste, dated February of the coming year, spoke of pregnancy progressing despite all expectations. The doctors called it miraculous, she'd written in her clear merchant's hand, but I know better. My body, freed from poison, simply remembered its purpose. The chateau itself seems lighter, as if the very stones have exhaled a breath held too long. Henri had undertaken renovations both physical and spiritual. The portrait gallery was permanently closed. Those murdered brides finally allowed their peace. Philippe now managed the estates with modern methods imported from Lyon, while Marie-Claire had risen to household manager, her practical intelligence valued above bloodline for perhaps the first time in the chateau's history. Isabelle will spend her remaining years in a convent hospital, the letter continued, nursing the genuinely ill with the same attention she once applied to creating illness. She went without protest, almost seemed relieved. Perhaps prison is its own freedom when you've been chained to inherited evil your entire life. The diligence stopped at an inn where travelers already spread the story, though transformed by telling. The Montmoreau poisonings had become 7 brides, not 4. The artist was now Italian, or perhaps Dutch, commissioned by royalty to paint portraits that revealed guilt in the subject's eyes. Our painter ate his soup in silence, listening to his own history become legend, understanding that this too served truth. Stories that warned, that taught, that armed the innocent against those who would prey upon trust. Paris materialized through the rain as evening fell, its 1,000 lights beginning their nightly constellation. The city felt both foreign and familiar after his time in the Loire Valley, like returning to a song in a different key. His studio in the Marais waited, dust-covered but intact, his late wife's portrait still maintaining her vigil on the wall. How strange that he'd accepted the Montmoreau commission to escape her ghost, only to discover she'd been guiding him throughout, in recognizing symptoms, in refusing silence, in choosing truth over comfortable blindness. The dead don't leave us. They become the measure by which we judge the living. He unpacked carefully, each item carrying its weight of memory. The completed portraits seemed to glow with their own light, Celeste surviving against probability, Marie-Claire radiant with uncomplicated love, even his sketches of the chateau documenting beauty that had masked systematic murder. His father's watch ticked in his pocket, still keeping time despite all that had passed, a reminder that mechanisms could be understood, adjusted, repaired. On his easel he placed a fresh canvas, mixing new pigments by lamplight. Tomorrow there would be other commissions, other faces to capture, other truths to document or diplomatically obscure.
But tonight, he would sit with good wine and contemplate what the Loire Valley had taught him, that evil wore the face of duty. Tradition could be another word for murder, and the most dangerous poisons were those administered with care. Through his window, Paris went about its evening business, indifferent to individual tragedies and triumphs. Somewhere in the Loire Valley, a woman who should have been dead was preparing for motherhood. A household was learning to function without poison. Portraits of prematurely dead women were finally being allowed to fade from prophecy into history. The artist raised his glass to his wife's portrait, then to the Montmoreau women, both living and dead. They'd taught him that sometimes the painter's role transcended creating beauty. Sometimes it meant revealing the poison beneath, documenting not just what was, but what was being hidden, ensuring the pattern was recognized before it could claim new victims. His father's clock chimed midnight, marking the boundary between one day and the next. Time, that patient solvent, was already beginning its work of diluting the past's poisons, carrying them away grain by grain like sediment in a slow river. The artist prepared his palette with the colors of tomorrow: ochre for earth, ultramarine for sky, and yes, lead white for light, though he now knew its double nature intimately. In 3 months, Celeste's child would quicken in a womb that had survived poisoning. In 6 months, roses would bloom in gardens that had witnessed generations of murder. In a year, perhaps 2, the Montmoreau story would be just another cautionary tale told by firesides. But for now, in this moment suspended between brush and canvas, between memory and possibility, the artist held the weight of witnessed truth. He began to paint.